This is a subject that I have talked about on the show before, but I like to revisit every so often because I think it answers some of the common questions that people have when they're getting really serious about becoming photographers. And you know, a lot of what we do on this show, we talk about process and we talk a lot about photo lit and we talk about a lot of style and what makes great photographers great photographers. I try to turn you on to new names. And what I want to do is I want to do a little subject that I call interpretations. And this is one of my favorite things to talk about because when you can start making connections between artists and start seeing the relationships and the differences that make them unique, I think it really starts bringing it into a new light that makes it very accessible for you to bring into your own work. So without further ado, I'm going to go take a look at some images. So come on over and let's talk about interpretations. So when I was preparing this presentation for you guys, I realized that this is a very strange photographic journey that I'm about to take you on, which I think makes it interesting, and it also emphasizes my point here, is that, you know, this whole idea of interpretations, we have all these common subjects that have been shot over the course of the history of photography, and what makes it really interesting are not so much the subjects, but the interpretation by the photographer and how the photographer interprets or sees what it is that's and communicates that. And first off, I've picked the Calla Lily, and the Calla Lily is a flower that's been shot by thousands and thousands of photographers many times, and I've picked several photographers who I think are really good examples of how to infuse this personality into it. I'm going to start here with this, and this is Tom Burrell, and if you have watched the show for a while, you probably know that Tom Burrell is one of my favorite photographers. I just think the world of Tom. He's been a huge influence on me. I find him very inspiring. He shoots a lot of alternative process, and he did a huge body of work on flowers. Now, what's interesting about Tom Burrell is he actually worked for Robert Mapplethorpe, who's another photographer known for a body of work with flowers, and he was also greatly influenced by Karl Blossfeldt. And the interesting thing, though, is Burrell's work doesn't look like either one of those two photographers at all. I think, you know, being influenced and looking like someone, you know, there's different ways you can be influenced by people. And this is a really interesting subject for him to tackle, particularly having worked for Mapplethorpe. But you can see this is an alternative process image. The interest with what Tom Burrell does is, you know, this relationship between the two lilies that you see. There's distance yet closeness with them. It's a pretty conventional shot, depth of field with a flat background with a little bit of texture on it. It's a wet plate image. You can see the emulsion peeling up from the bottom left corner. And it's just this beautiful brown tone image of two calla lilies, and it has a lot of personality to it. This image is also Tom Burrell, same flower. It's a completely different interpretation of the same subject. What he's done this time, and Burrell is known for this quite a bit, is he will shoot things from very unusual angles. So we're seeing the back of the lily in this case. And to me, it really starts bringing a lot of personality to something like a flower because it's almost like a portrait in that sense. It's posing the subject and not just shooting it straight, and I think that's really interesting. I love the swirling focus in here, the alternative process technique on here, and it really almost looks like a charcoal drawing or something. It's just absolutely beautiful. There's a nod to pictorialism perhaps here, done with a modern interpretation, and Burrell is so good at this stuff. I just think the world of him. Next up is Burrell's former employer, Robert Mapplethorpe. And you can see how greatly different Mapplethorpe's images are. This is not alternative process. This is classic silver gelatin. And what you're seeing here, if you're familiar with Mapplethorpe at all, Mapplethorpe had a huge influence of Roman and Greek classical sculpture in his work. And you see this very blatantly obvious in a lot of the nudes that he did, but you see it also in the botanical work with these pure whites and this almost sculpture quality to this with the classical composition and very conservative in some ways. And, you know, right here we have, this is again Robert Mapplethorpe, but a completely different interpretation of this. And there's a lot more going on in this image, just the way the flower's been tipped upside down, suspended in the air, the hard light, you see the shadow, and then I really love the way this leaf kind of comes down to the right side there and really just gives it a delicacy and a lot of personality. So it's a very different interpretation. Compare that with, say, Tina Modotti. Tina Modotti is slightly obscure, but she was a wonderful Italian photographer, and this is her representation or interpretation of the calla lily as well. Completely different, very different style. Compare that with somebody like, say, Chuck Close. Again, another photographer, very contemporary here, but if you're familiar with Chuck's photography work, he has this way of doing subjects like this with these black backgrounds and this way of lighting them that gives them this glowing quality and this slight gold tint to them, and they're just absolutely beautiful. And it's Chuck's personality. I mean, if you're familiar with Chuck's photography, this fits right in. And it's just really interesting to see side by side how all these people have interpreted the same subject in very different ways that infuse their own personality into it. And it's a very subtle thing. Sometimes it's the process they're using, sometimes it's the focus, sometimes it's the composition, sometimes it's the lighting. It's an amalgamation of all those things. We're going to shift gears a little bit, and I want to take another object, and we're going to look at the Chrysler Building in New York, which is the famous Deco structure. And you're going to see some photographers that you're familiar with that we've talked about recently. This is Michael Kenna, and Kenna is wonderful, and this is a really interesting interpretation of the Chrysler Building at night. This is another Kenna interpretation that's completely different. And what we see here is the Chrysler Building, but it's set in a very unusual, unconventional way of seeing it. So for instance, we're used to seeing the Chrysler Building amidst Midtown Manhattan with all the buildings around it, but we've got an angle here where we see more of a flat landscape behind it with a little bit in the background, but these very dramatic clouds, and then also the way that he has lowered the subject into the bottom of the frame. Very unconventional and very different and very cool. Just really interesting. And you compare that to a different photographer, let's say Hiroshi Sugimoto, the great Japanese contemporary photographer, who has a series of architectural forms that he shot where he does this technique that he calls beyond infinity focus. And essentially, if you work with a large format camera, you know, you're on a rail system. And it's the same as when you are with any camera lens, you focus up close and then you focus the other direction and it goes out and stops at what they call infinity. Well, on a rail camera, you can continue to move it. And so he actually takes these past infinity. And so that's the whole idea. It's this kind of mathematical thing, but it's a very simple technique. But they have a real specific blur to them. And what's interesting is the way he abstracts the subject by blurring it out, but still retains the personality. And you see this in all the architecture work, that you can still tell, you can make out those forms, those deco forms at the top of the Chrysler Building that are just, you know, it's beautiful. But it's a very different interpretation than what, say, Michael Kenna did. Here's Tom Burrell again. We saw his flowers earlier. He did a series of urban landscapes in New York, toned prints that have a very beautiful quality to them. The lighting is really beautiful and subtle, and I'm sure he was very particular about the time of the day on these, but a really beautiful shot, probably bringing to mind people like Paul Strand or somebody like that, but quite different at the same time. And then Burrell, this is another shot, and I'm sorry it's a little bit blurry, I couldn't find a large enough example of it. Another one of my favorites though, and this was an image that he made from another building, but you see the Chrysler Building in the window, and reducing your subject like that, subframing, hard lines, hard shadows. I guess there's a Paul Strand feel to it, but again, it's very contemporary. He's put his own stamp on it, and I think that's really, really interesting. Another well-known structure I want to look at that's been photographed to death is the Eiffel Tower in Paris. And first up, we have one of Michael Kenna's interpretations, which is a little bit different from Kenna. It's not the square format, and it looks like it's probably a pinhole image or something like that, or maybe a Hogue image that he does. Because of the way the distortions come in the foreground on what you're seeing on the concrete texture there. It's a very different interpretation, and this is something that, you know, a lot of people have shot over and over again, and it's a different look. This is another Michael Kenna image, and it's similar to the first, but a little more refined. You have a reflection going on with the Eiffel Tower in this case, and very beautiful. And it's interesting, particularly to me, here's a third Kenna, completely differently interpreted. One of the things that's interesting about Michael Kenna is he reinterprets his own work quite a bit. And what's really cool to see about that is the same subject shot different ways, you know, this whole idea of interpretations that we're looking at, but he's reinterpreting himself, and it still has his personality there within, and I think that's something that's outstanding. Another well-known image, and we're back to Sugimoto here with the blurred out look. This is the past infinity, and you still have the form of the Eiffel Tower. It's very important that it still retains its form, even though it's blurred out. It's just a layer of abstraction, which is very different than something let's say such as this, which is Elliott Erwitt. And yes, it's an interpretation of the Eiffel Tower, but this is where this presentation will start leading you in strange places. But we also have this interpretation being that the Eiffel Tower is included with a group of people that kind of says Paris. There's a jovial quality to this. There's a sense of passion with the two lovers with the blown out umbrellas on the right. Awesome image and very playful, a lot of personality, and it starts becoming a very different image than these, you know, building portraits that we've been looking at. And since we're talking about people jumping over puddles, you could also kind of look at this action as an interpretation of the way people pose the human figure at times. And we've gone from Elliott Erwitt's famous image, and I'm sure Erwitt was familiar with this one. Everybody is. This is the famous Henri Cartier-Bresson image of the man jumping over the puddle, which was a very improvised image. Apparently, Bresson was sticking his camera through a fence. It was really hard to get. And anyway, it's one of his most well-known shots. Happened in a second, you know, the whole decisive moment thing. But again, this interpretation of somebody jumping over a puddle, which brings us to another one, which is Richard Avedon's famous fashion image of the woman with the umbrella. Now, one thing that you need to know about Avedon, when he was doing all of his fashion magazine work, especially in the early days, his predecessor, somebody he knew that was very influenced by, was the great Martin Munkácsi. And we talked about Munkácsi on the show probably about a month ago or so, and Munkácsi is a fabulous photographer. And Avedon went on record as saying that this image in particular was an ode to a shot that Munkácsi was well known for, which was this one, where we have the woman jumping the other way. And it's really interesting, and we're going to look at this in a minute, but a little bit of this homage kind of treatment of images. Sometimes it's an action or a figure or a gesture or something like that. And you can reinterpret somebody's photo as being your own and paying homage to them. So this was the original, the Munkácsi image, and then Avedon took this one later. And always referred to it as homage to Munkácsi, and really beautiful image. I'm going to shift around a little bit, and I want to look at people for a second. And this is a really interesting subject because what I've done is I picked one person here who is an artist who had his portrait made many different times by many great photographers, and it's interesting to see how all of these photographers interpreted Giacometti. How all of these photographers interpreted Giacometti. And Giacometti was a sculptor, and you've probably seen his work before. He does these kind of strange, kind of, you know, mud-slung stick figure-looking things that are very skinny, and the lines are always exaggerated. And he has a very distinctive style that he made these sculptures in. They're very beautiful pieces. He was very prolific. These are in a lot of major museums, and these are some portraits that were made of Giacometti. And Giacometti was kind of a character himself, and in some ways he kind of had an appearance that was not in many ways unlike these figures. This is a famous image that was taken by Gordon Parks, another fabulous photographer, and it's really interesting to see how he incorporated elements of the hand and the figure to personalize it, but then Giacometti's in the back and he's blurred out a little bit, and so it's more subtle. It brings some the psyche forward of maybe this is what's going on in Giacometti's mind or something like that. So very different. This is also Gordon Parks, and I love the way he's positioned Giacometti within some of these figures and really brings him into the work. Again, Giacometti had a very severe appearance and very intense characteristics in his face. And, you know, this is really interesting because we look at a completely different interpretation of this, and this was taken by Henri Cartier-Bresson, and who was also friends with Giacometti, and I love this with the cigarette hanging out of the mouth, and he's showing Giacometti walking around the studio setting something up with his obvious character appearance and the way he's walking mirrored by one of his sculptures. And again, he's bringing the artist into the work, which is very interesting. Now, what's really interesting about this is this last interpretation of Giacometti that I want to look at, and this one is Arnold Newman. And the interesting thing about this is Newman is very well known for environmental portraits, and particularly with artists to incorporate the work with the artist on some level, and he really didn't do it as much here. You have a very beautiful portrait of Giacometti in the lower part of the frame there, and he's just set against a table with some bottles on it, and it's a beautiful portrait. But it's really interesting to see that Arnold Newman opted not to do that on this, and I kind of wonder if maybe it had something to do with the Bresson picture, or maybe there was something else that influenced his decision. I don't know the backstory fully on this one, but it is really interesting to see that the guy you would expect to really have a literal interpretation of the artist and their work really didn't. So, you know, what we've looked at here are 4 examples by 3 photographers of the same subject. In this case, it's a person, it's an artist, it's Giacometti, and all of them very different, all of them very different personalities. Back to Henri Cartier-Bresson a minute. I want to talk about two examples here to wrap this up that I find very interesting because they bring back this idea of the homage. And we talked about this a second ago when we looked at Avedon and Munkácci. And this is a very well-known image by Henri Cartier-Bresson of a group of trees on a road on the French countryside, and we have a reinterpretation by Michael Kenna. And he titled this piece Homage to HCB, who we know is Bresson. And it's really interesting to see that, you know, Michael Kenna found this scene, obviously knew about the Bresson image, titled it as such, he didn't steal it, but he has a reinterpretation of it. And I think that's really cool, really beautiful, and it's a really wonderful exercise to do sometimes, is to take something that is originally interpreted by somebody and do your own homage to that. And, you know, gosh, if you look at the stylistic elements with the mist and the way the light works in here and the contrast, it's just what Michael Kenna, it's Michael Kenna at its finest, echoing Henri Cartier-Bresson. One final image I want to look at, and this is a pretty obscure photographer that I want to talk about. This is a gentleman, well, first of all, let's look at the original image. This is a Steichen image of New York, and this is the Flatiron Building, and Steichen's shot a lot of these where, you know, very interesting weather conditions, a lot of times gloomy rain, sense of darkness to the image, and the way that you lose a lot, very pictorialist style, but a lot of the detail is back in this kind of mist in the air and the atmosphere, but you see these little pointed lights that come through via the street. And what's interesting is there's a photographer who, by the name of Wolf van den Bussche, and Wolf van den Bussche is more obscure. This is one of his images. He's not very well known. He was extremely good. He died a couple years ago. This particular image is his homage to Steichen, and this is obviously New York, and he's captured a lot of that with this mist quality and this layer of abstraction to things. They're soft shadows that just kind of give a suggestion of the landscape, but with those little bright pointed lights that come through that tell you there's a street there with cars on it. I think that's amazing. Wolf van den Bussche, this is actually from the collection of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, LACMA, and he did a lot of work that was homages to various people, and he would title them such. And I love the fact that this isn't an homage to one specific work. He probably could have gotten the Flatiron Building in a way, but I think it's really cool that he opted for something different. So his homage is in the style of. But what's interesting is this whole in the style of, he had his own style that's very contemporary that he was dealing with that shows through. And so in a lot of ways, these are not copies. You know, certainly none of these homages that I've shown you are like that. So anyway, we are done with our photography journey here, and I know this was a little weird and a little long-winded, but I think it's interesting to look at this whole subject of interpretations, and I hope you guys have found some inspiration in this and maybe some ways that can inspire work that you would like to do as well. So anyway, that is our little thing on interpretations. I want to take a second and give a shout out to our sponsor today, who are the awesome folks over at Squarespace.com. If you're not familiar with Squarespace, it is an all-in-one solution for building websites. So it is everything that you need to build an awesome website, portfolio, online store, blog, whatever you need to do on the web, Squarespace have you covered. And what you get with Squarespace is an outstanding hosting service. You get a beautiful set of templates to start with, and they're all customizable so you can get it looking unique and like you want it. And everything works on mobile. It works on desktop. You don't have to think about any of the code under the hood, and it's really, really cool. The other really neat thing that I'm going to show you is the content management system that they are calling Squarespace 7, and it's got some really neat things in here. What we're looking at here is, this is compositionstudy.com, which is a blog that I built on Squarespace, and you can go through here, and this is a collection of stuff that we did with our composition episodes. So if you're interested in rule of thirds, rule of odds, you just click on the page here, and you can go look at the sample image, you can get the description, you can roll through here and look at all the techniques that we discussed. And what's really cool is if I need to make edits, I go into the Squarespace backend here, and literally this is easy as dragging and dropping, clicking the plus sign to add new pages. If I want to build a gallery, I just bring it in as a block, and if you can drag and drop a folder of images off your computer, you can build a gallery. There's no code to write, there's nothing to do other than just to make something awesome, and that's one of the reasons I really love Squarespace. If you're interested, and you should be, I would go over and check it out, because they are offering a free trial right now, and it gives you time to evaluate Squarespace, see if it's something that you think you could use for building a website. And if you're interested in subscribing, I can save you a little bit of money. So what you want to do is use an offer code on checkout, and that offer code is AOP, and that that lets Squarespace know that I sent you, and you're going to get 10% off your subscription. And once again, that offer code is AOP. And head over to squarespace.com and check it out for yourself. No credit card required. You can just sign up for the service and check it out for the trial period. And I think you should, because it really is worth it just to check out what they're doing with Squarespace 7 and a lot of the ways they make it very easy to build and manage content online. So once again, I want to give a special shout out to the folks at Squarespace and thank them for once again sponsoring another episode of The Art of Photography. One of the things that I find very interesting about all this is I commonly get asked, and I think it's very normal for photographers to think this, is, you know, how do you develop your own personal style? You know, we do a lot of photo lit on here. We do a lot of process, and it's a question that I don't think me or anybody else can give you a really easy answer to. It's a very difficult answer, and it's a quest, and it's a lifelong search. At the same time, though, too, I think that there's a really important part of incorporating your personality and being comfortable with what you like to see, what you like to do, what you like to shoot. And that's what makes it kind of interesting. We were talking about Michael Kenna. I showed some of his images today in this, and we also talked about him in his own episode a week or two ago. And what's interesting is Michael Kenna, and this was a quote, and I don't remember exactly how it went, but I'm paraphrasing, but you know, he came to the U.S. to work for Ruth Bernhardt early in his career, and he was trying to figure out how to develop his own style and what went into that. And Michael Kenna certainly has a very defined style and something that he's very visually, it's very easy to recognize a lot of times. And you know, what he has said about that is, you know, it's kind of like asking somebody, why do you sign your name like that? Or why does your handwriting look like that? Nobody thinks like that, but we all have an individual way we do things, an individual way we sign our name, an individual way that we write letters when we handwrite things. And it's creating something, but it's a reflection on just who we are and what our physical makeup is. Some people work very hard at having very nice handwriting, others don't, like me. You know, some people work really hard at photography and embracing the elements of who they are and what makes them them, what their personal tastes are, what their views of the world are, and how they communicate that through the lens. Some people work less at that. So anyway, I think that's what it is. It's a combination of diligence and not giving up and working really hard at something, and at the same time being able to accept and incorporate elements of who you are into that. Anyway, I think it's a very interesting question. You know, I don't feel like I've ever really gotten a handle on what I would like my personal style to look like. I'm sure there's a way that it looks just because I'm me. But I think this is a really interesting topic because I think making these connections, and this is one of the reasons I'm so interested in other photographers and photo literature and who some of the greats are, who some of these contemporary names are. And this is why I share all this with you on the show, because there's a lot you can learn. And that's why I like in doing these interpretations episodes, because when we start to put things together and make connections between people, I think there's a lot you can learn. And when you realize where people come from, their place, where they are in time, where they are in the history and the evolution of photography, and how that all comes together and how that ties it all together. You know, somebody like Chris McCaw has a very definitive style and concept around what he does, which is very different than what Michael Kenna does, which is very different than what Hiroshi Sugamoto does, which is different than what Steichen or Stieglitz did, or anybody that we've talked about on the show. They're all unique, but they all fit together in the grand puzzle, so to speak. So anyway, I hope you found this interesting. If you've enjoyed this video, remember to like it and share it with your friends, and remember to follow us on social media and subscribe for the latest and greatest episodes as they come out. And one other thing, remember to head over to the website, which is theartofphotography.tv. Sign up for our email list. We're about to launch a new website in the coming month or so here, and I'm really excited about this. And if you sign up for the mailing list, you'll know exactly when it comes out. I don't send spam, I don't sell t-shirts, I don't sell stuff. I just put stuff in there that might be interesting for you guys. And I like to expand on what we've talked about the shows and give you guys other links to exhibitions that might be going on around the world and things of that nature too. So remember to head over to the mailing list, or to the website, and sign up for the mailing list. I'll have links for everything down below. And once again, thank you for watching another episode of The Art of Photography. I'll see you guys in the next episode later.